Ms. May, Saanich Island, seconded by Mr. Scarpaleggia, moves that Bill C-226, an act respecting the development of a national strategy to assess, prevent and address environmental racism and to advance environmental justice, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Merci, Madame la
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleagues here this evening, because this is a very, very important private member's bill.
Stand here to present Bill C-226 at the first hour of its second reading. I want to begin with a very heartfelt meegwetch and a recognition that we stand on the territory of the Algonquin Nation. It is their land. Madam Speaker, I want to take a moment to describe how we got to where we are today, because it's rare for a private member's bill entering its first hour of second reading to have already had any parliamentary history at all. And this has a lot of parliamentary history. So I want to start by saying this bill received wide support under a different mover. It was in the last Parliament, Bill C-230, and it was moved by the then magnificent Member of Parliament from Cumberland, Colchester, Lenore Zann. Yes, please. Lenore moved this bill forward, and as you can tell, she was elected as a Liberal Member of Parliament here, but she's quite a non-partisan individual. She served also with distinction in the legislature of Nova Scotia as a new Democrat MLA. She's carried with her a concern for environmental racism a long time. And she did me the great honor in making this a nonpartisan bill, as I'm very honored to have the Honourable Chair of the Environment Committee as the seconder of this bill now. We've wanted to make this a nonpartisan effort from its very inception as Bill C-230. Now, Bill C-230, with the same title, an act to address and assess environmental racism and move forward to environmental justice, received support at second reading and actually got to committee. Amendments were made in the Environment Committee, and I adopted those amendments in this bill at first reading, so that what we have in front of us represents work already done by Parliament. It's my deep hope and desire that all of us here, regardless of party, will find it in our hearts sometime in the near future to give this bill unanimous consent so that it can skip through stages it's already done, and so that we can get it through and sent to the other place so that it can become law and we can start working proactively to advance environmental justice. That is the hope with which I speak to you tonight. I'm grateful for the nonpartisan support the bill already has. You'll hear that in the speeches that are coming up. We also know from a question I put to the Prime Minister in question period that the government position is to support this bill. So we feel optimistic it will become law. But we'd rather it was sooner than later, because I now will turn to the history. This is not a recent issue, and we are late to act. Let me just say, Madam Speaker, that when you look through, before I even start that, I need to dedicate this bill to the memory of a friend of mine. Clotilda Coward Douglas Yakimchuk was a magnificent woman, a hero in the community from whence she came. Her parents came from Barbados in the earlier parts of the last century to work in the Sydney steel mill. Clotilda is a proud black woman. She was the first community activist with whom I ever worked on the issue of environmental racism. Clotilda Yakimchuk died just about a year ago, practically a year ago today, April 15th, 2021. She died of COVID. She was the first black woman, first black person to receive a nursing degree at the nursing schools in Nova Scotia. She was the first black woman to be the president of the Nova Scotia Nurses Association. She was aware of and fought against the pollution between the coke ovens of the Sydney steel mill and the steel mill itself, and the high cancer rates in that community of Whitney Pier. So this bill, when it becomes law, I hope people will remember that it's dedicated to the memory of Clotilda Yakimchuk. I also want to say that one of the things I worked with in cleaning up the Sydney tar ponds with Clotilda, you can recognize that as a reality that toxic chemicals do not discriminate. They're not paying attention to the color of your skin. When they lodge in your body, when they pass the placenta to your children, when they cause cancer, when they cause birth defects, they don't care the color of your skin. But the public policy that puts Indigenous peoples and communities of color far more frequently at risk of being exposed to toxic chemicals, that does notice skin color. That does notice whether you're marginalized. That does notice whether you have money or not. So it is absolutely the case that this country, with all of the evidence that we have of racism, it can't be denied. I know this bill makes people uncomfortable because is there racism in Canada? Yes. We just had a report today about the racism that repulses people as new recruits out of our military. Every institution in this country experiences racism. Environmental racism is not something new. Let me go through some of the history we have of that in this country. I'm going to turn to books for a moment. The first book that really focused on this problem was in 1977 by one of Canada's great journalists, Warner Troyer. The book is called No Safe Place, and it's the story of the contamination by Dryden paper of the Indigenous community at Grassy Narrows. We're still dealing with that, the mercury contamination. Another book on the same topic of the mercury contamination of Grassy Narrows is called A Poison Stronger Than Love, The Destruction of Ojibwe Community by Anastasia Skrylink. She was one of my constituents, and also in her memory, I bring this bill forward today. In 2000, actually, I co-authored with Maud Barlow, who was then the national chairperson of the Council of Canadians, the book Frederick Street, Life and Death on Canada's Love Canal, dealing with the issue that I mentioned and I referenced. That's where Clotilda Yakimchuk and I first became friends. The contamination of Sydney tar ponds led to the highest cancer rates in Canada. They were in industrial Cape Breton. The place that became the tar ponds was an estuary where the Mi'kmaq community had traditionally had summer fishing camps. The land was stolen, of course, and then became the worst pollution zone in Canada with the pollution from the coke ovens and the steel mill. And in between, a community called Whitney Pier, which was virtually entirely immigrant Canadians, such as a lot of people from the Ukraine. You might have noticed that I mentioned Clotilda's last name was Yakimchuk. Her husband, Danny Yakimchuk, was a steel worker from Ukraine. It's a melting pot community, Whitney Pier. It's a fantastic place, but the cancer rates are through the roof. So the land was stolen from the Mi'kmaq. They got the contamination too. So did the only black community in Cape Breton. And it was, as Clotilda described it to me, that I recorded in the book, it was impossible to find housing anywhere but in that community. So the racism was enforced. We didn't have Jim Crow laws in Nova Scotia in the 1970s, but we might as well have, because there's no way an experienced nurse who was black with her children having moved back from Grenada after her first husband passed away, she could not get housing anywhere except in the most contaminated neighborhoods. That's called environmental racism. That's what it is. So we've got a history here. Now, looking at books, the most important, and without a doubt, the 2018 publication of Dr. Ingrid Waldron's book, There's Something in the Water, Environmental Racism in Indigenous and Black Communities has changed the conversation in Canada. And that was fortified by a year later when Dr. Waldron co-produced with the magnificent, I keep saying the word magnificent, let's just change it to brilliant, Nova Scotia actor Elliot Page. They co-produced the film that introduced people to this concept. Now that's part of the history. Let's look at some else. Where else have people done anything about environmental racism? I have to say I've been a bit shocked and perturbed, as has my friend Lenore Zann, by some of the social media reaction to us tabling this legislation, as if we're kind of weird lefties and we made it up because we just want to make racism a thing. No, this is empirically established. We know this is true. In 1994, the U.S. government took action because it was clear on the evidence that if you lived in a community of color or an Indigenous community, you were far more likely to be exposed to levels of toxic contamination that imperiled your health, the health of your children, your family, your neighborhood, your community, and also other people who weren't of color, other people who are marginalized. So it's a bunch of different issues that have to do with if you have power and money, like you live in Shaughnessy or you live in Westmount, nobody opens a toxic waste dump in your backyard. That's the reality. And in Canada, as in the US, if you're marginalized and without economic power, a person of color or Indigenous, that's where you might be much more likely to be exposed to toxic contamination. The U.S. recognized this, and since 1994, my dear friends, the U.S. government, through the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, has a program that's well-resourced for environmental justice. And what does that justice look like? Putting the tools in the hands of marginalized people to fight for their own health, to make sure there's resources for epidemiologists, make sure there's resources for toxicologists, and to make sure the governments spend the money to clean up the mess. So, we are late in Canada. The U.S. took action again. Hear me. The U.S. took action 28 years ago. This is not a new issue. We are late. So we need to get this bill passed, and we need to see environmental justice being championed in this country with a well-resourced program in environmental justice, and where we take our blinders off and say, yes, oh, yes, there is a thing. It's called environmental racism. And we're not going to water it down and ignore it because it's still happening. It's happening today when they try to reopen the Pictou Mill and reopen the contamination that has so affected the people of Pictou Landing. By the way, I see the Minister of Immigration in the room, so I'm just going to give a shout out to the Honourable Member for Central Nova for being the first federal member of Parliament from that area who was prepared to say this mill should close because the jobs are not worth the damage that's being done to Boat Harbour, the Indigenous community of Pictou Landing, and the neighbourhoods in Pictou. Just to say, that's brave. But they're still trying to open it again. It's seen in Ganasataki, where there's still illegal dumping of toxic chemical in and around the community of the Mohawk community of Ganasataki. This should not be allowed. It wouldn't happen in other communities. We're looking still at Grassy Narrows. And we look in Sarnia, the community of the First Nation of Aamjiwnaang First Nation. I invite colleagues from any party to go to Sarnia and visit the enclave surrounded by petrochemical plants where the Aamjiwnaang First Nation cemetery is. They're completely surrounded, and the industry just got a 2-year extension on cleaning up the sulfur dioxide from that refinery. And that affects settler culture Canadians too. But that community, those toxic contaminants ring completely, encircle Aamjiwnaang's center. Look at the Lubicon. The oil sands have been contaminated communities of Lubicon First Nation now for long enough that we wrote about it in 2000 in Frederick Street, Life and Death on Canada's Love Canal. We don't need to look far. We don't need to look back at deep history. But we do need to be honest about the fact that this is a pressing issue and requires action. It's a terrible shame, and I'm sorry to say it because Liberal colleagues are supporting this bill, so I say it without malice, but it's a shame the election was called when it was because this bill, having gotten a lot of support, died on the order paper. So we're starting again. I would really love it, and I know so would my friend Lenore Zann, who's here in Ottawa today as a former member of Parliament, to see her bill go to second reading for the second time. We would really love it, and I'm sure other members of every party in this place would appreciate that we don't need to take it to committee again, study it again, make the same. You can't make the same amendments because this bill includes the amendments the committee made last time. Let's do something for environmental justice. Let's stand up and say there's a better way to deal with the right to a healthy environment, which we actually don't have in this country, to make it real, to have a right to a healthy environment, then every citizen, regardless of the color of their skin or their economic status, and in the case of Indigenous peoples, the double horror of we steal their land and then we fill it with toxic chemicals. This is not something that any parliamentarian should feel comfortable allowing to continue. So I really beg all my colleagues, regardless of party, je comprends bien, je comprends.
I understand that this is a difficult issue, especially when there is a question of racism, inequity, inequality. But please, everyone, I implore everyone to support this private member's bill.
I think 35 seconds left, Madam Speaker, so I just want to say again, this bill will be all of our bills. This is not a Green Party legislation. I mean, I'm completely supported by my colleague from Kitchener Centre. We don't want to own this. Collectively, all our hands are on this baby. This bill will matter. It matters for environmental justice. It matters for our future. It matters for who we are. Thank you. Meegwetch. Merci.
The Honourable Minister of Environment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to thank my honourable colleague from Saanich Gulf Island for retabling this bill. She is right. The government supports this bill. And I want to thank her for her many, many years and decades of activism on environmental racism, because it's a thing, Madam Speaker, despite what some people, unfortunately, even in this House, think. So my question to the member, and she did touch on it during her presentation, but can she elaborate a little bit about the science supporting the very fact and the very existence of environmental racism? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
And thank you to my honourable colleague, the Minister of Environment, and I thank him for his decades of activism. I pray they're not over. I appreciate his support on this bill. And I do genuinely appreciate his support on this bill and on many things. Look, the science is clear, but we don't have enough science. That's one of the reasons there was an amendment made at committee that I completely support. It was an NDP amendment. They said, look, let's make sure we're gathering the data. Let's assess. We don't save data as often as we should that breaks down by discriminatory categories who's most exposed to toxic chemicals. We know who's most exposed to toxic chemicals: people of color, Indigenous peoples, and people who are without economic clout from settler cultures. We know that. But the science is very clear, and this is a lot of what was put together empirically. Dr. Ingrid Waldron right now is the preeminent Canadian expert on mapping where you find high levels of toxic waste, and then you can look and you map that out, and lo and behold, you find people of color and Indigenous communities are out of any sort of normal statistical variation, far more prevalent in the categories of people exposed to too many toxic chemicals.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Repentigny.
The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. In the Bloc Québécois, what we think it would be better to talk about environmental justice for everyone. 77 people in an area close to mine are not immigrants, but they live with a financial situation which is far inferior to others. But there are industries that create noise, dirt, pollution. So these are non-immigrant workers. They are not people who come from immigration. They're born in Canada. So this kind of thing affects everyone. The issue of environmental justice affects everyone, no matter where you were born, no matter the color of your skin or anything else. What does my colleague think? The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands. I'd like to thank the member for Repentigny, and I agree with some of what she said, because it's not only communities of color or Indigenous communities who are the victims of toxic waste. And I'd also like to say that I so appreciate the work my colleague has done on issues of climate change and other major issues. She works very hard on the environmental file, but I don't agree with the idea that you shouldn't say certain words. We have to say them. It's racism, and it is a threat.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member from Saanich Gulf Islands, especially for putting forward this bill. the member briefly mentioned what the U.S. is doing, and I'm wondering if the member could speak a bit more about the models that the U.S. has to tackle environmental racism and environmental justice, and what we can learn from them.
For Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you. I was remiss in not publicly thanking the honourable member for Victoria for working with me on this bill. I'm very grateful that she raised with me that I basically, one of the history things is I drew a really good number. There's a lottery for private members' bills. Many viewers may not know that. I got a good number. That's why I'm up early in this session of Parliament. We're going to get this bill passed. And I thank the honourable member for Victoria for her help. Just to say, in the U.S., they call it, in the EPA, the EJ program. Everybody knows what it is. You're going to go to the EJ program and get funding. You get support. It's a very robust, professional, scientific program within the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and it's operated for almost 30 years.